The phrase, "sit down, girl," was more than just an offhand comment. It hit a cultural nerve that resonated far beyond the hearing room walls. On the surface, it might have seemed like a typical sharp exchange in the high-pressure environment of political debate. But those three words carried weight, steeped in a long and complex history of dismissive language, particularly toward women, and even more pointedly toward women of color. The tone, delivery, and timing of the remark combined into something that felt strikingly outdated and jarringly disrespectful. It wasn't just that it was said in a political context, it was how casually it was said, as if it were perfectly acceptable to interrupt someone mid-question and reduce their presence to something less than serious. In that moment, the phrase wasn't just a verbal interruption, it was a symbolic push back into the margins. It suggested a kind of hierarchy, one where some voices are allowed to speak freely while others are told, explicitly or implicitly, to stay in their place. The phrase also illuminated how certain expressions, even when not shouted or aggressively delivered, can carry deeply embedded condescension. Language has a history, and words, especially when paired with a certain tone, can call up generations of meaning in a single breath. Girl, as a diminutive term in professional or political settings, is often seen not as a neutral word, but one that infantilizes, trivializes, and dismisses. Add "sit down" to that equation, and it's no longer about policy or disagreement. It becomes personal. The reaction in the room revealed the moment's gravity. People didn't just hear a typical political jab. There was a subtle, collective shift in energy. A pause, a tightening of posture, a sense that something had crossed an invisible but widely understood line. Even those not particularly aligned with the person on the receiving end of the remark seemed to realize it had gone too far. The chamber, usually accustomed to sharp tongues and partisan clashes, became unusually still. That silence, brief as it was, said more than words could. On social media, the clip was replayed again and again, not just because of what was said, but because of what it symbolized. Commentators, journalists, and everyday viewers quickly dissected the exchange, pointing to the historical baggage behind such language. Many drew parallels to past instances where similar phrases were used to diminish or silence women during moments when they were asserting their views. There was an uncomfortable familiarity to it all, a sense that, despite progress, certain dynamics still reared their head at pivotal moments. Critically, the phrase didn't just offend, it triggered reflection. For some, it was a reminder of how often women in leadership roles are spoken over, cut off, or talked down to in ways their male counterparts are not. The casual nature of the insult made it more insidious, because it revealed how normalized that kind of language can be, even in spaces where professionalism is supposed to reign. There's also a cultural nuance in how the phrase was received. The word girl can have different connotations depending on who says it, how it's said, and to whom. But in this instance, it wasn't a term of endearment. It was a directive meant to silence, a phrase that functioned like a verbal hand wave. It sent the message that the speaker didn't consider the other's words, or even their presence, as valid or worth hearing. The backlash didn't arise from hypersensitivity or over-analysis. It came from a collective recognition that respect matters, especially in political discourse. The issue wasn't disagreement. Disagreements are expected in those rooms. The issue was how disagreement was expressed. There's a difference between arguing a point and dismissing a person. In politics, where image and language are everything, those lines are watched closely, and in this case, one of them was clearly crossed. Ultimately, it wasn't just about decorum. It was about whether the space was truly one where all voices could be heard with equal legitimacy. And for many watching, that moment raised doubts. The phrase may have lasted only a second, but its impact lingered, prompting questions about who gets to speak, who gets interrupted, and what it means when certain words are used not to engage, but to undermine. What stood out most in that charged moment wasn't the insult, it was the response. In an environment where emotions often run high and reactions can quickly spiral into spectacle, the choice to remain composed became the most unexpected move of all. There was no shouting, no sharp retort, no verbal escalation. Instead, there was a steady breath, a calm posture, and a deliberate reply that cut deeper than any counter-insult ever could. It wasn't just a response, it was a reset of the entire tone of the exchange. Her decision to stay grounded in that moment wasn't weakness, it was strategy. By refusing to meet the insult on its level, she elevated the conversation and, in doing so, elevated herself in the eyes of many watching. It's often assumed that power is expressed in volume or in the quickness of a comeback. But real power, the kind that leaves a lasting impression, can also be found in restraint. She demonstrated that strength isn't always loud. It can be quiet, firm, and unmistakably clear. The moment called for grace under pressure, and she delivered exactly that. The hearing room, thick with political tension, suddenly had a different kind of energy. It wasn't that the tension disappeared, it was that it shifted. Now the focus was no longer on the insult itself, but on how it was handled. Her posture didn't change. Her tone didn't rise. She simply responded, plainly but pointedly, reclaiming her authority not through confrontation, but through clarity. She made it clear that she wasn't there to trade jabs or score points. She was there to do her job, and that job included challenging ideas, asking difficult questions, and representing her constituents with integrity. By making it about the work, not the insult, she reminded everyone in the room, and those watching, from afar, that professionalism isn't just about following rules, it's about knowing when not to take the bait. Her words were few, but they were loaded with history and awareness. When she acknowledged the weight of what had just been said to her, she didn't dwell on it or make it a personal grievance. She placed it in context, not as an isolated slight, but as part of a long-standing pattern that many in the country recognized immediately. It was a response that spoke not only to the moment, but to the broader experiences of countless others who have been told, in one way or another, to be quiet, to sit down, to defer. And yet, she didn't respond with anger. That's what caught people off guard. In a time when political clashes often devolve into viral shouting matches, her response was a kind of quiet resistance. It was sharp without being bitter. It was assertive without being aggressive. It left no room for misinterpretation, and that clarity was its own kind of power. The response also reframed the dynamic of the room. After the comment was made, there was a collective sense that a line had been crossed, but it was her reply that confirmed it and moved the conversation forward. She didn't demand an apology or lash out. She held her ground, not just physically but rhetorically. Her words turned the spotlight away from herself and toward the broader issue of how people speak to one another, particularly in spaces that are meant to serve the public. Her approach invited reflection rather than retaliation. That's what made it so effective. The people watching weren't just left to analyze what had been said. They were encouraged to think about how it was received and what that said about leadership. It wasn't about getting the last word. It was about setting an example. She demonstrated that you don't have to meet disrespect with disrespect. You can choose a different way, and that choice can speak volumes. In the aftermath, many people, regardless of political affiliation, were struck by the balance she maintained. Between strength and composure, it wasn't about being passive, it was about being principled. Her response served as a reminder that dignity can be a political act, that refusing to be reduced by someone else's words can change the entire narrative. The power of that moment didn't lie in how loud it was, but in how controlled it was. Her words weren't just a rebuttal, they were a lesson in how to hold space without letting the moment define you. That kind of control, the ability to command attention, not with anger but with clarity, is what made the exchange, brief as it was, triggered a wave of discussion that went far beyond the walls of the hearing room. In the hours and days that followed, what began as a single sharp remark evolved into a much broader public conversation about how language, tone, and subtle dynamics shape professional and political interactions, especially when those interactions take place in full view of the nation. The moment wasn't just about two people at odds. It became a mirror reflecting deeper societal tensions, particularly around respect, representation, and how race and gender still influence whose voice is heard and how. Many observers recognized that the words used weren't just ill-mannered, They were part of a larger pattern that has existed for generations. In professional settings, women, especially women of color, have too often been on the receiving end of patronizing or dismissive remarks that carry the message, "You don't belong here." These comments are rarely explicit. Instead, they're cloaked in condescension or casual language that, on the surface, might seem minor, but in reality, reveals deeply entrenched power dynamics. It was precisely this undercurrent that made the remark resonate so strongly with people across the country. The reaction to the moment highlighted how acutely tuned audiences are to these subtleties. It wasn't just what was said, it was how it was said, when it was said, and to whom it was directed. A phrase that might have been brushed off in another context took on an entirely different meaning when directed at someone who already represents multiple layers of underrepresentation in government. The optics, the tone, the choice of words, all of it combined to create a moment that felt painfully familiar to many and tone-deaf to others. What followed was a noticeable shift in the conversation. Suddenly, the discussion wasn't about the topic of the hearing anymore. It was about civility, about dignity, about the unspoken rules that govern political spaces and how those rules are enforced or not, depending on who's involved. For many, it wasn't even a question of political sides. The issue transcended ideology. It was about a baseline of human respect and how easily that can be threatened when bias, conscious or unconscious, goes unchecked. The public's response underscored just how layered the moment was. For some, it was a flashpoint, a clear example of how women in positions of authority are still subjected to language designed to belittle or undermine. For others, it was a wake-up call, forcing them to reevaluate the standards they apply when watching public figures interact. Would the same words have been used with someone else? Would they have been tolerated? These weren't just rhetorical questions. They were questions that invited deeper introspection about fairness and equality in public life. The moment also prompted institutions and commentators to confront their own complicity in normalizing certain types of language. Media coverage varied, but many pointed out how incidents like these often go unchallenged unless there's a public outcry. That in itself spoke volumes. It suggested that the line between acceptable and unacceptable discourse remains blurry, and that clarity often comes only after someone refuses to let the moment slide. This refusal to ignore or normalize the comment wasn't just about defending personal pride. It was about setting a precedent. It was about asserting that respect should not be conditional and that professional spaces, especially those meant to serve the public, should uphold standards that reflect the diversity and dignity of the people who occupy them. That includes calling out behavior that diminishes others, even when it's veiled in politeness or brushed off as a joke. What made the public reaction so powerful was that it didn't require exaggeration. The comment spoke for itself. But more importantly, the response to it spoke volumes. It showed that people are paying attention, not just to what politicians say about policy, but to how they treat one another when the cameras are rolling and the microphones are on. It showed that voters care not just about positions, but about posture, about the tone and respect leaders show toward one another, especially in disagreement. As this conversation spread across social platforms, op-eds, and workplace discussions, it highlighted something essential. That language is never just language. It carries the weight of culture, history, and power. And when used carelessly, it can expose more about the speaker than any political argument ever could. The impact of that brief exchange didn't end with the hearing. It spread, first through social media, then through mainstream news outlets, and eventually into everyday conversations across the country. What made it so compelling wasn't just the moment itself, but how it became a kind of national litmus test for values like professionalism, respect, and emotional intelligence in leadership. As the video clip circulated, people weren't just reacting to a soundbite, they were responding to what it represented and how it captured something larger than the political setting in which it occurred. The response was both immediate and widespread. Journalists debated the implications, opinion writers weighed in on the dynamics, and average citizens posted their own takes. Each person seemed to see a different facet of the moment. Some focused on the language used, others on the composure maintained in response. Still others looked past the details of the argument and focused on what it said about how power is wielded in public spaces. The conversation didn't follow typical partisan lines. It transcended politics because it touched on something universal: the expectation that those who serve in public roles should lead by example. This wasn't just about who was right or wrong in a given exchange. It was about what kind of leadership people want to see and what kind of behavior they're willing to accept. For some viewers, the moment affirmed long-held frustrations about how some public figures are spoken to, regardless of their credentials or the seriousness of their work. For others, it was a wake-up call, a realization that decorum and civility still matter, and that public trust erodes quickly when those values are disregarded. What was particularly striking was how the public didn't just focus on the insult itself, but also rallied around the measured, thoughtful response. That kind of maturity, shown in real time under pressure, became the centerpiece of the conversation. In an age of viral outrage, the refusal to react with hostility stood out. It felt intentional, and it resonated. People noticed the choice to center substance over ego, and many saw that as a reflection of true leadership. The moment also sparked a renewed discussion about representation in government. When someone who has historically been underrepresented in positions of power faces dismissive language in a public forum and handles it with composure, it forces a conversation about equity and visibility. It challenges old stereotypes about who belongs in leadership and how they're expected to behave. The public didn't just see a tense exchange. They saw an opportunity to reflect on what inclusion really looks like, not just in theory, but in everyday practice. Educators, civic leaders, and community organizers used the moment as a teaching tool. In classrooms and workshops, people replayed the clip to talk about conflict resolution, communication styles, and the importance of standing firm without compromising grace. It became a case study in how to assert oneself without resorting to the same tactics used to diminish. That in itself was a lesson, one that resonated far beyond the political arena. Media analysts also noted how the incident highlighted a growing appetite for authenticity in leadership. People are tired of performative outrage and rehearsed talking points. They want to see how leaders behave when caught off guard, when tensions are high, and when their character is truly tested. This moment offered a rare glimpse into that kind of vulnerability and strength. The reaction it provoked suggested that many viewers found the composed response not only appropriate, but aspirational. As conversations about the incident continued, they began to evolve. People moved beyond the initial controversy and started asking deeper questions. How should leaders manage disagreement? What does real professionalism look like under pressure? What are the long-term effects of allowing disrespectful behavior to go unchallenged in public life? These weren't questions with easy answers, but they showed that the moment had touched something deeper than political rivalry. The most telling sign of the exchange's influence was how it endured. Long after the headlines faded, the memory of that moment, how it unfolded and how it was handled, remained fresh in people's minds. It was referenced in interviews, speeches, and debates, not just as an isolated event, but as an example of how restraint, dignity, and self-respect can reframe even the most heated interactions. In a political landscape often dominated by noise and conflict, this moment of clarity and resolve offered something rare, a demonstration of leadership that didn't require shouting to be heard. In the end, what made the moment unforgettable wasn't the insult. It was everything that happened after. In the space of just a few seconds, a seemingly simple exchange unraveled a much larger national conversation about how we treat one another, especially in public service. It wasn't just about two individuals exchanging words in a tense setting. It was about how we, as a country, view dignity, restraint, and emotional maturity in moments that demand leadership over ego. Across political divides, there was a surprising level of agreement. The response was powerful, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it wasn't. It was intentional, measured, and completely unshaken. That kind of presence, graceful under fire, set a new standard, or at least reminded many people of the kind of leadership they still hope is possible. It sent a message that you don't have to raise your voice to be strong. You don't have to trade barbs to command respect. Sometimes the quietest reply speaks the loudest truth. In a world where outrage often fuels attention, this moment stood out because it didn't follow the usual script. There was no public meltdown, no viral tirade, no performative confrontation. There was just a deliberate refusal to be rattled, a clear-eyed response, and a quiet reminder that not every battle is worth escalating. That's not just maturity, that's strategy. And it's rare. For those who watched the moment unfold, whether in real time or through countless replays on social media, it was more than just political theater. It felt deeply human. It touched something raw and real, especially for people who have, at one point or another, had to maintain their composure in the face of condescension. It was a moment of representation, a moment of validation, a moment that said, "You're not alone in that experience, and there is a way to rise above it without shrinking in the process." Perhaps that's why the moment endured. It reminded people of the kind of tone we still want in our public discourse. It pushed past party labels and policy points to something more fundamental, character. And in doing so, it offered a rare kind of clarity. It showed that while insults may grab attention, it's integrity that holds it. Leadership isn't about winning every argument. It's about knowing which moments matter and how to carry yourself when they arrive. In this case, the words that shocked America weren't the ones shouted, they were the ones calmly spoken. And through that quiet strength, an example was set, not just for politicians, but for anyone watching who ever wondered how to stand tall when someone tries to knock.